Yes, we do have some questions. Let me share my screen, sorry. Yeah, I think we see a different approach between Europe and the US when we see your representation now. And here is a question of a comparison of the building emission, but said the building could be low emitting or very low. Does this refer to a specific indoor air contaminant like formaldehyde, or does it refer to VOC, PM, or other? Are there any guidelines about what contaminant level meets the criteria for low or very low emitting building? So I think this is more a question to Bjarne here. So
Yes.
maybe Bjarne, you can answer it while we collect questions from Mark.
Yes. There is in the standards, or in a guideline to the standard, there's referred to some testing method of materials regarding emission. That helps a little to select the materials which have lower emitting. But I should say that this building component is a gray zone compared to the people component. The people component is more well documented than the building component. So we really need more data for buildings. We have decided to put it into the standard at that time to make clear to people, if you really reduce some of the emissions from the building, you can reduce ventilation. So you get an advantage there. But I agree, it's not very clear exactly to find out where your building is in the three categories. But it's mainly VOCs probably. Yes, Mark?
My own opinion is that there is no evidence behind any ventilation standard related to health effects of pretty much anything in buildings.
Mm-hmm. No, it's mainly comfort, odor.
Okay, and then I would be interested to have your answer on this question that has been asked to Bjarne about what would be the relevant CO2 set point in your view in a bedroom.
I don't have an opinion on that. I imagine it might depend on the bedroom and the occupancy and what effects you're concerned about.
Yeah. Okay. So you wouldn't say a value for that?
I think it's really not a good practice to give a value across many different settings, a single CO2 value.
Okay. So great review. What are your recommendations for how standard can become more science-based on this topic?
Let's see. It's an excellent but complicated question. I think first of all, you have to specify what effects you're trying to protect your occupants from, which is not often made very clear. And then you have to figure out what are the exposures that cause those health effects, and then do some research on how much ventilation you need to control the exposures. Like the Nordic Ventilation Group did specifically with COVID exposures, and then they used numbers specific to COVID to calculate a minimum ventilation rate, and then they used a mass balance model to calculate a maximum CO2 level. And I think that's a good map for how to do better standards for indoor air quality related to health.
Okay. So back from your publication in the 90s, you show clearly that going below 10 liters per second creates a risk. Would it make sense to convert it in CO2 steady state and use as a guideline value? If the CO2 steady state is a relevant guideline value, by the way, but that's another question.
Well, the earlier reviews were I think fairly crude, and they just suggested that when you compared ventilation rates, the ventilation rates below 10 liters per second per person were associated with increases in building-related symptoms, But building-related symptoms are just one very non-specific kind of health effect. I would say we need to think more clearly about what are the health effects we're interested in and what the exposures behind those might be. And so I wouldn't suggest starting with 10 liters per second per person as some kind of a meaningful number, and then estimating CO2 levels based on that.
Okay. Can you tell us about the importance of time averaging for setting carbon dioxide? How long does the CO2 concentration have to be measured?
Well, so I'm an epidemiologist, not an engineer, so I'm probably not a good person to answer this question. But my understanding is that people who want to use maximum CO2 measured in a building will often do a time average of 10 or 15 minutes to avoid meaningless variation. And on the other hand, an 8-hour time-weighted average of CO2, I think, is really not a good idea, because you're not getting at a peak concentration. You're not getting at the steady state concentration that you really want to be getting at.
Yeah,
And as to how to measure CO2 concentrations, I have no opinion on that.
Okay. And we've got one last question about the Nordic guidelines appear to be similar to ASHRAE 241 through only one mitigating using outdoor air and not on filtration and other measures. Can you comment on the difference between the guidelines you reviewed versus standards?
Let's see. ASHRAE Standard 241 has a logic behind it that I'm not really familiar with. I understood it was not that clear, and they didn't set a CO2 limit, I don't think.
I can explain if you want.
Maybe in the question time afterwards.
Well, the ASHRAE standard are setting like the standard for ventilation 62.1. They have a table where they specify what you should ventilate in case of a pandemic. The whole calculation background is not in the standard yet, but they are working on making a more complete standard where you can see how they got to the numbers. Now, the European method, which will be in the European standard I mentioned earlier on the revision, they are coming up with a ventilation rate, but the two other measures using air cleaning filtration is also included. In the equation, there is a part which is dealing with air cleaner, and the third way of reducing the exposure is reduce the number of people in the space, and that is also a possibility in these calculations.
Okay. Thank you, Bjarne. We now need to move to the last presentation, unless, Andy, you wanted to...
Very quickly, the 241 standard, those rates are clean air equivalent, so they account for filtration, not just outdoor air. And so the CO2 would not reflect any filtration of the infectious aerosols. Sorry to hold us back.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. Then I think we will move the ball to the last presentation. So, John, the floor is yours.